One reason I don't like doing work for others is sometimes they give you like their photo. I kind of had some photos of the child they wanted me to paint. I kind of didn't like them, but there was one photo that I saw that caught my interest, and it was the baby being sideways. In all my paintings, the background has just as much importance as the actual subject. In this painting, obviously the face is the most important thing, and secondary is everything else. But you can make an argument also the hands are just as important. But the point I'm trying to make is, I want to spend just as much time detailing the clothing as I did with the face. Once I felt the face was enough to move on, I started detailing the clothing even more. I paid attention to the form of the clothing, everything from the folds to what was in the dark and what was in the light. I wanted to create a sense of depth. I did not want it to look flat. So I used every trick of the trade in my disposal. I would brighten certain edges like here in the sleeve and cool down the sides just to give the illusion that it's popping out. Hands are just as important as doing the face, so I did spend a lot of time on doing them, just layering colors. What I focused on is the highlights and the shadows to create the form of the hand and fingers. The details were simple to do, but you had to do them along the folds of the clothing to create a illusion. By doing that, it also helps create volume since the details wrap around the form. Like before, I knew that the details would bleed into the white, and because of that, I always kept in mind I will go back. So I didn't worry too much about them being as precise as possible. I just wanted to lay them down. In order to create the volume of the fingers, again I used cool and warm tones in specific areas. I had to very carefully look at the photo, and this was a very tedious layering process. I probably went back into this hand multiple times, including one more time after I finished this time-lapse video in order to correct one of the fingers. So yeah, lots of layers. But the idea is to use light and shadow in order to carve out the hand and fingers and all the other features like the folds and knuckles. And since this was a baby's hand, it was more on the chubby side. If it was an older person, I'd probably be detailing the wrinkles. Colors play a very important role in the lights and shadows. As you can see, the folds that are not in sunlight are in the blues, and the ones that are more bright, which I use titanium white and a bit of orange. Also the left hand and its sleeve, I wanted it to pop out the most, because in a way that was one of the closest things to the viewer. Not all shadows are the same color. Some actually have reflection from other parts of the clothing, such as this yellow that's casted onto the side of the baby's chest. There was also tones of orange and green also on the sleeve. In order to capture that, I used some viridian and also cobalt blue here and there. And then as you can see, the shadows underneath the chin are on the orange tone, and then there's some blues besides the yellow in some of the shadows on the folds of the clothing. If you notice from this sleeve, I initially laid some bold orange, but towards the end I did mute it down a little, but I just wanted that bright orange to come through. And I started developing also some sharp dark lines in some of the creases. That way the highlights would pop out more. And as you can see, more details on the clothing that wrap around the form. And some barely visible, but I had to add them, but in a more blurry way. And in some areas I used pure white for it to pop out. Besides blues, I also used greens in order to get some of the shadows. Keep in mind, some of the birdies that were yellow are more green when they're in the darkness. Think of a blue shadow casting over the yellow, creating that green. Also, some of the red in the shadow would also be more on the purple side because, again, the blue over the red. Once the paint started to dry a little, I started correcting some of the blurry areas that I wanted sharp. Some of the details I did not go overboard on, like here on the side. I made sure it was blurry so it could recede. As for the background, I tried to copy the colors I saw. The baby was laying down on a bed and it was more in the grayer tone, but I paid a lot of attention to the color and how it transitioned. And plus it wasn't completely smooth. There was a little bit of texture in the bed and I tried capturing it, including this heart that you see on the side. But some of the colors I tried to lay were the darker blues and oranges, and in some ways they intertwined. The most important thing I did though while I did the background is paid attention to the edges where the baby and the clothing met. Like mentioned before, don't be afraid to apply paint with a palette knife and then spread it around with a paintbrush, because a paintbrush on its own can do only so much. If it helps and it's possible, turn the painting to the other side. I did this at one point so I get a better view of the birdies and parachutes right side up instead of sideways. And as you can see, I was using a actual stretcher and braced it on my easel in order to have my hand a little more steady, but also some of the paint was actually still wet. I was trying to recreate the texture of the yellow stitching on the baby's clothing and also brighten up some of the spots where the sun hit the folds a little more, and of course sharpen some edges and also enhance some of the shadows as well. I paid attention to the color of the yellow because it wasn't just straight yellow. There was some orange, there was some blues that turned into green, and also 2 lines of stitching that I had to carefully paint but not make them too obvious. Instead, give them a very blurry look. I felt it was time to move on and finish the face, so I started layering and layering more color. This was a very tedious process. Instead of going for a smooth finish, I went for a very impressionist-like approach where I just kept putting little strokes of paint and color next to each other. I used blues, I used pinks, and laid them next to each other where I saw them fit. Oh, and this nose was the biggest pain in the world. Sorry for the hairy shoulder, but yeah, I got in the way. Also went back to certain areas like the lips and increased the darkness, particularly where the highlights met the inside of the mouth. That way they stood out more with contrast. Also, I went back into them and added a little more texture because they're not completely smooth. They have little ridges. Besides the nose, the other area that was kind of a pain and very frustrating to do was above the lip and also the right cheek. It was very gradual changes of light and dark, and I had to pay very close attention to the colors as I layered them. I probably went back into both of those areas multiple times in order to get them right. It involved laying this grayish green and then pink and even blue and orange to get it right. It was very subtle transitions to form the shape above the lips and where the cheek met, and also the chin, which even has some yellow reflect into it. I paid attention also to the subtle blues that were not too dark in order to form the shape of the baby's face. And I wanted you to visually feel the contours and shapes. And I tried to achieve that with lots of gradual transitions of color, light and dark, cools and warms, and highlights in certain areas so they stood out more. To get areas to stand out, don't be afraid to use very generous amounts of paint. I did that for some of the areas where they were in direct sunlight, and areas that were receding a little were more on the thinner side. Towards the end, I evaluated certain areas of the painting, and one of them was the side of his cheek. I tried to push it back more so the rest of the face popped, and created a transition from light and dark all the way where the face met the clothing. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. Sadly, I did not film the whole process because I was in a rush to finish it before I left for Greece, but I did get the bulk of it at least. Once again, my name is Charlimbos. I go by Bob. I am not your typical painter. Thanks for watching. Also, check out my Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course. Thanks. Bye. Stay tuned for more.